Through Oculated Proof, photography has revealed many strange and wonderful things during the last 20 years, but few so strange or startling as the existence of natural photographs or optograms in the eyes of the deceased. The pictured image of the object last seen has thus been made to yield up its secrets to the living. The perpetrator of the murder has more than once, I believe, been in this way discovered and brought to justice. The only wonder is that the camera is not oftener used in all such cases of doubtful identity. But I know for an even stranger thing about retinal optograms, stranger that is from the psychological standpoint, and one which moreover came under my own personal observation. The speaker, a well-known eye and ear physician, here paused a moment to light a fresh cigar. The events I refer to, he went on, took place in the early part of the 70s. I was then practicing in the city of Memphis. There came to me one day a lady of distinguished bearing and great beauty, followed by a Negro nurse girl with a fine baby boy in her arms. My visitor's errand concerned the child. They had discovered him to be totally blind and had accordingly brought him to me for consultation. The lady also, at the same time, introduced herself by name, which I immediately recognized as belonging to one of the oldest and best families in the place. It did not take much professional experience on my part, however, to convince me of the utter hopelessness of the case. "Madam," I said, "it is my opinion that the child was born blind. In that event, is there no hope?" she asked anxiously as I paused. "I grieve to say it," I returned. "I will, however, make a closer examination before pronouncing a final opinion." She caught eagerly at the suggestion, and the child submitted patiently enough to the adjustment of the lens. But it was even as I had supposed. The tissues were all in perfectly healthy condition, and save for the unobservant look peculiar to the blind, one would not easily suspect the little one's infirmity. The loss of sight was then plainly due to nervous trouble, probably prenatal, for he had never been seriously ill, she assured me, and in that and any case apparently hopeless. I was accordingly about to withdraw the glass and give it as my final dictum that nothing could be done, when certain very fine lines on the resting retinal background caught my attention. Without remark, I quietly exchanged my lenses for another with higher magnifying power. A startling revelation awaited me. On the dark visual pupil of the eye were the delicately drawn outlines of a miniature face. Too minute, indeed, for observation of detail, there could be no mistaking the actuality of the fact. Examination of the other eye revealed the same surprising result. Here, indeed, was something worth investigating. 1,000 conjectures passed through my mind. If the child had, as I believe, been born blind, then the very image was very likely natal also. But how such an impression could have been made upon the eyes of an unborn child passed my understanding. Could it be that the sympathetic relation existing between mother and child was, in this case at least, close enough and strong enough to result in such an extraordinary phenomenon? That the mother had in some way suffered a sufficiently powerful mental shock to produce such sympathetic vibration? But what if, after all, the child had not been born blind? Then the fixed image must be due to some equally severe nervous shock, and which also was very likely deprived him of sight at the same time. Of the two suppositions, the latter seemed by far the most natural and probable, and yet my professional conviction was that the child had been blind from birth. In either case, the cause itself must have been an extraordinary nature in order to produce such a startling effect. But if I could get at the circumstances which had occasioned the loss of sight, I was also convinced that the retinal impression might stand a fair chance of being accounted for. For it was my opinion that the causes which produced the one had the other for a result as a consequence. Assuming, first, that the child had been born blind, and without saying anything as yet of my discovery, I made inquiry if he had ever been subjected to any severe mental shock. Ever been badly frightened by any particular person, for instance? The reply was a prompt negative. Mrs. D, or so I will call her, adding, moreover, that she was absolutely certain on that point, since she had the care of him from birth. I infer then, I observed, that you yourself are not his mother. You will pardon the remark, as I am exceedingly anxious to ascertain the cause of his blindness. You are quite right. His mother was my sister, and died giving him birth. I reflected a moment, and then suggested that the nurse be allowed to take the boy out into the adjacent garden. And now, madame, said I, when we were once fairly alone, permit me to put you one more question, that I do not ask it in the spirit of idle curiosity. You will presently have abundant proof. Related as you are, you can surely tell me whether or not the child's mother herself ever suffered such a shock as I have described. For answer, the beautiful face of my visitor suddenly turned so white and drawn that I sprang for a glass of water. Stay, she murmured faintly, it will pass. And then, presently recovering herself, continued in a low, strained voice. My sister's married name was Brainerd, Mrs. Howard Brainerd. You must have recognized it. Understand? Mrs. Howard Bernard of White Oaks. I do indeed remember it. Pardon me for causing you such distress. She was found unconscious by the side of her murdered husband, she went on, as if I had not spoken, and died without a sign the evening of the same day after giving premature birth to this child. We cannot doubt that she saw the whole dreadful deed, or that is, the shock killed her. I recalled it all as I sat there for a little in sympathetic silence. I remembered reading up the entire case in the daily press, and after being interested in the mystery surrounding it, the parties were high on the social scale in the neighboring state, belonging to one of the most honored and courted families. Howard Bernard, the victim, was not known to have a single enemy. On the contrary, he was everywhere liked, and, if reported be true, deservedly so. There seemed, therefore, no cause for the dastardly deed, a deed, moreover, which had, so far, gone unpunished. For, in spite of all that wealth and influence could do, no clue to the murderer had been discovered. A fearful storm had raged the same night, obliterating all traces. Someone, it was, familiar with the place and its surroundings, someone who knew the ins and outs of the house, such as when it might have been, and such as one had come and gone, leaving no clue behind. I recalled all this, I say, as memory did its work. An idea flashed through my brain like an arrow of light. I fairly held my breath at the thoughts of the possibilities thereby unfolded. A plan of action speedily evolved itself, a plan by which I might not only prove the scientific value of certain inductions of my own, but by which I might also aid in the meting out of justice. But how to set it about? I ransacked my brain for all the facts and theories that I had ever heard or read of connected with somewhat similar cases. My mind made up, I turned again and said as gently as I could, and hoping to change the current of her thoughts, I promise you my final opinion, madam, as to the boy's eyes. I regret to say that I still deem his case an utterly hopeless one. But there is a peculiarity about the eyes themselves that lead me to think that we may, through them, be able to render his family an important service. She looked puzzled, but she said nothing, listening only with gradually increasing interest and attention as went on. I will give you good reasons for the hope that it is in me, and you shall presently see. You have, I presume, heard of the natural photographs, optograms. Well, as you know, upon the retinal membrane of the eye, images of what we see are being constantly reflected as in a mirror, with this difference that they are in reverse. Like the reflections in a mirror, they are a transient nature, constantly coming and going, evanescent, but given peculiar circumstances, such, for instance, as we would result in permanently fixing any one of the images on this retinal background, we would then have a natural photograph. or optogram of the object seen. Such circumstances are thought to be present during the last fleeting glances of a dying person, and in fact, several such retinal impressions have already been discovered and made use of. Now, if we photograph this optogram immediately after death and throw its enlarged copy upon a magic lantern screen, we will of course be able to see and perhaps recognize that which was last seen by the person deceased. Mrs. D here broke in with exclamation, "But you forget, a sister has been dead for some 3 months." "Very true," I said. "But if you will remember, I said that my hopes were based on the child. It is my belief that the sympathetic vibrations existing between the mother and her unborn babe was sufficient, in this case at least, to transmit the last retinal impression produced on her eyes to those of her child. And so terrible was the shock that caused this vibration, and so powerful the vibration itself, that also sufficed to destroy his sight. As a matter of fact, madam, the peculiarity I mentioned is nothing more or less than just such a natural photograph or optogram. But you'll see for yourself." And without further delay, I called the nurse and adjusted the lens. The lady, now painfully agitated, looked with a low cry of astonishment, acknowledging the truth of my remarks. It was a great disappointment, however, that she could not recognize the face, but the fault probably lay in its minuteness. And deeply impressed with the possibilities of the case, Mrs. D decided on having the retina photographed and then reproduced enlarged upon the screen. Meantime, she would telegraph for Judge Bernard as the one most interested, and the first throwing of the image should be in his presence. Pending this, she desired the matter kept as private as possible, for after all, our hope might be in vain, and the miniature face, a mere freak of a nature, the knowledge of which was best reserved for the family circle. All things must be arranged. The lady took her departure. In the afternoon, the camera did its work, and by noon the next day, everything was in readiness. In order to observe privacy, I had fixed upon my private offices for the occasion, and by the way of trial, threw the face of the screen before the arrival of the others. A startling, handsome face it was, handsome as only Creoles and Southerners occasionally are. A man's face, in the prime of youth, clear cut, clean shaven, and in fact almost feminine in the delicate style of beauty. There was nothing suggestive of a hardened criminal, nothing hinting at depraved taste or brutal instincts, but the expression, startled horror and bewilderment, where they were blended, dilated the eyes and fixed the parting lips, as if the man had been suddenly transfixed, momentarily paralyzed by a sudden and unexpected shock of vision. But what struck one of the most forcible was the nameless something in the riveted look, a something suggestive of blunder, as if there had just flashed through his brain the dread consciousness of having committed such terrible mistake. It fascinated me, that look of startled horror and amaze. Promptly at the hour designated, Mrs. D put in an appearance, accompanied by a stately, gray-haired man, whom she introduced as Judge Brainerd, and with them came along a nurse and a child. The judge listened with the keenest interest of my theory of the case, and expressed a deep-voiced wish that it might prove true. He had never recovered from the shock of his son's death, and the desire for vengeance on his murderer was naturally strong within him. First satisfying himself with regard to the existence of the optogram in the eyes of the child, he expressed himself impatient for a sight of its enlarged image. Without delay, therefore, we three adjourned to the private office. As we entered the room, I noticed that Mrs. D seemed strangely agitated and uneasy. She said nothing, however, but afterward told me that she had at that moment an almost overpowering presentiment of coming evil. That the judge was himself excited, I could not doubt, but it was rather the excitement of the expectant curiosity stirred by lively hope. As for myself, through vague consciousness of coming crisis of some sort, my uppermost thought was a question. Would the judge recognize the face? and somewhere within the inner consciousness of mine, there arose the answer, yes. The final adjustments made, I slipped in the slide, and the next instant, in bright, bold relief, the beautiful face flashed upon the white field of canvas, a thing of almost supernatural vividness and power. A breathless silence followed the revelation. I heard Mrs. D catch her breath convulsively, and then from the man beside him there came a long, low, inarticulate cry, succeeded by a heavy fall and a woman's scream. An apocalyptic fit, the doctor said, and as soon as possible they removed the unfortunate man to his own house. And after days he recovered in general health indeed, but by some curious half paralysis of the brain, his memory of events for the better part of his past life was entirely blotted out, and so it remained till the day of his death. That the judge had recognized the face was only too evident, as witnessed the fatal results, but Mrs. D had not, and so for the time the mystery seemed only to deepen. By request, I had an enlarged copy of the photograph made later on and sent to the family. But now behold the strange evolution of events. The optogram had apparently served its sole and destined end. It was no longer of any use, for, almost simultaneously with the sending of its photographed image, there appeared in the columns of the daily press for a long and sensational account of the murder from beginning to its recently discovered end. The man had been found at last, but found dead. A dagger in the heart told the manner, and on his person was a paper containing a virtual confession of the deed, of the motives impelling thereto. It ran substantially as follows. An all but white man was he, son of a remarkable, beautiful, and for a slave, unusually refined and intelligent octoroon, who had served at one time as the lady's maid to Judge Brainerd's mother. Some domestic trouble occurring in the family, she was, as a direct result, sold to parties resident in a distant state, dying there some years after, so her son averred of a broken heart. The writer further declared that he had sought the Brainerd mansion with his express intention of killing the judge in his sleep. Cleverly disguised, and by fraternizing with the servant, he made himself tolerably familiar with the house plan, absenting himself then for a time so as to avert suspicion. He returned one dark, stormy night and made his way unobserved into what he supposed was the judge's own private apartment. He seemed a recumbent form on the bed and approached the noiseless steps. The storm is at that moment at its height. The sleeper, roused by the tumult of the elements, or was it some prescience of approaching danger, stirs uneasily as if on the point of awakening. With a bound, the murderer springs to his side. There is an upward gleam of steel, a swift downward stroke, followed by a groan. All is over. The man turns to flee, when suddenly there comes a blinding glare of lightning, accompanied by a heavy crash of thunder, and, ah heavens, in that passing flash he sees, by the side of the murdered man in the upturned, terror-stricken, staring eyes of a woman. And he sees also that the man he had just slain is not the man he sought. It did not need the final proof seduced by the writer as to his identity. This all but white man and would-be avenger of his mother's honor was Judge Brainerd's natural son, and it was, beyond a matter of doubt, a vivid likeness existing between mother and child that had brought such instant conviction and fatal result of the heart and brain of the unhappy man. The dead had been avenged indeed. This has been Through Oculated Proof, published in Short Stories Volume 5, 1891, written by Mark L. Griswold, narrated by Conan Stewart for Tales Reawakened on YouTube.